All right, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Katie Carr. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator with Hilltown Land Trust. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hilltown Land Trust and introduce Kathy Zeller, who's presenting today, and then I'm going to hand it over to her. So Hilltown Land Trust is a nonprofit. We were founded in 1986 as an all-volunteer land trust. Since then, we have conserved over 5,000 acres of land in our 13-town region on over 45 properties. We're an affiliate organization of the trustees, which is a partnership that allows us to really focus on the core of our mission, which is protecting and stewarding land. And it also, the partnership gives us administrative support from a larger organization that's committed to this region. Another important part of our work is public events and education, such as this one. And a big part of why we're able to do that is the TerraCorps program. It's just a program of AmeriCorps, and Allie is our community engagement coordinator serving with Hilltown Land Trust this year. It really allows us to be a much more robust organization that has a strong community connection and maintains our volunteer base. We're a very small organization, so having the support of TerraCorps members like Allie makes a big difference. We're also able to protect land and organize events like this thanks to the generosity of our members and our donors. If you're a member, thank you. If you're not a member, please give today. We have lost some income from a number of planned events for this spring, and your support ensures that we can continue to plan and offer educational events like this one to the public. And I'm going to put a link in the chat box for you. And if you enjoy this presentation today, please make a gift in support of this presentation and future presentations like it, and our work of conserving land in the Hilltowns. We are currently in the works to plan some more events coming up for June and July, so stay tuned to our website, to our emails and e-news, to our Facebook page for news about those. With that, I'm gonna introduce you to Kathy Zeller. We are delighted to welcome her today. She's going to be presenting on her research on black bears here in Massachusetts. Dr. Zeller first contacted Hilltown Land Trust 2 years ago about using a few of our properties in the Hilltowns in her research on bear populations and bear behavior in Massachusetts. The public access properties that we own are open for a variety of uses, and so we were happy to let her use some of our properties for her research. And it allowed us a chance to set up our wildlife camera at her site, which is where we got some good bear videos and images like this one behind me here. Kathy's research is focused on the intersection of humans and wildlife, integrating the fields of landscape ecology, wildlife biology, landscape genetics, and biostatistics. She works to understand wildlife use of natural and developed landscapes. Much of her work is focused on identifying wildlife corridors between populations and protected areas. And Dr. Zeller holds a Bachelor in Science in Biology from Tufts University, a Master's in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana, and a PhD from UMass Amherst. Until very recently, she was a post-doctoral researcher with the Massachusetts Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, where she modeled habitat use, movement, and connectivity for black bear and moose in Massachusetts. And just a few days ago, she started her new position as research biologist for the Forest Service in Missoula, Montana. We had originally planned to do this presentation in person in late March, and obviously that became unfeasible. And so we are really excited that she can join us virtually all the way from Montana. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy for her presentation. And just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box, and I'll let Kathy know if there are questions that pop up. We'll have time at the end as well. And if you have, if you're calling in today, you can email me questions. The email address is Katie, K-A-T-I-E, at hilltownlandtrust.org. And I'll be checking my email inbox as well during Kathy's presentation for any questions. So with that, Kathy, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to let everyone know, feel free to jump in with questions as I go along. Katie and Allie are going to help me sort of moderate the questions. If I don't see you in the chat window, then they can sort of interrupt me. There'll also be time, as I said, after the presentation to ask questions. But really excited to be here today and be talking with you about some of the black bear research that we've been doing in partnership with Mass Wildlife throughout Massachusetts. And yeah, I guess I'll just jump into it here. So some history about the black bear here in Massachusetts. After settlers came in and basically wiped out the black bear population in Massachusetts, there was still a small stronghold of bears in the Berkshire Mountains. And since reforestation that has happened across the state, that bear population has grown not only in number, but it's also expanded eastward across the state and is getting closer and closer to the greater Boston metropolitan area. So you can see the green areas on this map are showing the current townships that bears have breeding populations in. I think that this map was just made a few years ago, and I think it's a little old already. It's still getting closer and closer to Boston. And you can see just the expansion in bear numbers. So in the 1970s, there were just about 100 bears in the state, and now the state estimates that there are about 5,000 bears. And I'll talk a little bit more about bear numbers across the state and some of our research to try and hone in on those exact numbers later on in my presentation. So as you can imagine, Massachusetts, it's the third most densely populated state in the country. So it comes with a lot of people and a lot of roads. And that brings bears close to people, and it brings bears into conflicts with people sometimes. So we have the classic bear at the bird feeder here on the left, just hanging out and having a good meal on someone's porch. And then we have a bear in a cornfield. So, they will eat agricultural crops as they become ripe in the late summer and early fall. And so the state was really, really interested in trying to figure out how bears were using landscapes around people, how they were moving through areas that were highly developed. And they want to use that information to try and reduce any sort of negative interactions between bears and people, to try and keep bears safe, to try and keep people safe, and to use that knowledge as these bears get closer and closer to even more populated areas near Boston. So given that, we had a bunch of different research goals. We wanted to study how bears were moving around, especially in relation to developed areas and human settlements. We wanted to identify important habitat areas for bears. Where do they do most of their feeding and moving around and denning? And then we wanted to use that information to simulate movement closer and closer to Boston. And then we also, as another project, want to estimate the bear population density across the state, which will allow us to get at abundance, or the number of bears that are in the state. So those estimates that you saw a couple slides ago, those are based on studies that were done in the early 1990s. And so much has changed with the human population and the bear population since then. We really want to get new estimates so the state has the most current numbers to work with when they go about their bear management plans. So in order to do that, we have a couple of different data types that we're working with. One is GPS collar data. So this is when mass wildlife researchers and bear biologists, they're going out there, they're capturing bears either at known den sites or in barrel traps during summer captures. And at that point, they will tranquilize the bear and they'll put a tracking collar on it. And the most recent collars are GPS collars that allow us to get a GPS location on that individual every so often. So most of their bears are collared at about a 45-minute to an hour fixed rate. So we're getting a location on each one of their collared bears about every hour. They've been doing this collaring since 2009. They're still doing this collaring on bears because we have a lot to learn about bears in Massachusetts still. But the results I'm going to be presenting to you today are from bears collared between 2009 and 2017. They're also mostly focused on female bears. So we have data from 44 females and only 4 males. And they're really focused on females because that's really what's driving population sizes, population health, are those females that are breeding and rearing cubs and seeing those cubs into adulthood. And so that's why the focus is on female bears. We have collars on females for multiple years. So we call that multiple bear years. So it could be 1 female for 2 years, that would be 2 bear years. So we have 107 bear years of data and almost 500,000 GPS points. So a ton of data. If you haven't figured it out by now, those red points on the map are all the GPS points over that time period for those 48 bears. And then we can tell a bunch of cool things with that data. We can ask, okay, when are bears denning in Massachusetts? And it turns out that bears that are going into the den without any offspring, without newborns, are denning a lot earlier than bears that are going almost over a month earlier than bears that are going into the den with newborn cubs. And basically what's happening here is that bears without newborns, they have bred and are going to be giving birth in the den. And so they're gonna require a longer time in the den to give birth and then to make sure that the cubs are old enough to exit the den safely. And here's a fun fact about bears, if you don't know it, they have something that's called delayed implantation. So breeding season for black bears is actually right about now. Yeah, late May, early June. So they're breeding now, but then they have delayed implantation. So if in the fall, the female is healthy enough to be able to give birth in the den, that fertilized egg that's floating around in her uterus will then implant and then she becomes pregnant. But until that time, it's just kind of floating around. She's not actually pregnant yet. So when she gets healthy enough in the fall, that will implant and then she can get pregnant and then give birth, usually late January, early February. So then the average, uh-oh, my screen stopped working here. There we go, okay. So the average den entry date across all bears is about mid-November. And then we see the same patterns for when bears emerge. So bears that are emerging with yearlings. So what I didn't say is that young will stay with the mother through 2 denning cycles. So they'll be born in the den 1 year and then they'll stay with the mom, they'll den again the next year, and then sometime late that next spring, they'll disperse and find their own home ranges to live. So bears that are emerging with those newborns are obviously emerging later, and then the average time that they're emerging from the den is March 22nd. So that's the time to take your bird feeders down in the spring, so you're not attracting bears and giving them those supplemental food resources that can get them into trouble. And here's just another way to look at that. Bears that are denning with yearlings are denning for a shorter period of time. So we have days on the x-axis where we have anywhere from about 60 to about 200 days. And you can see that bears with newborns are denning for a much longer period of time. The other cool thing that we can find out about bears is how large of a territory or a home range they use in Massachusetts. And so each one of these different colored blobs on this map is a different home range for one of our collared bears. And if you look closely, you can see that the sizes differ quite a bit across the state. And what we found is that west of the Connecticut River, where there tend to be more bears because more bears have lived there for a long time, a higher density of bears, home ranges are quite a bit smaller. They're about 26 square kilometers in size. But east of the Connecticut River, they're about 4 times that size. So that's another research question that we have, or why this disparity in home range size. Is it because of the bear density and the bears are just more packed in west of the Connecticut River? Is it because of differences in habitat on either side of the river? So that's a question that we're hoping to answer in the future. So then for our movement analysis, we wanted to model bear movement a whole bunch of different ways. We wanted to know how they were moving around during the daytime versus the nighttime, how they were moving during different seasons, whether it was different in the spring, summer, or fall. We wanted to know what environmental features, what landscape features they were responding to as they moved. Were they avoiding areas with roads and humans? Were they using those areas? And then what we can do with that information is we can project the probability that a bear will be moving through any area in the state of Massachusetts. So those were our goals for the movement analysis. And here's just a little video of one of our GPS collared bears. This is on the Prescott Peninsula on the Quabbin, if you're familiar with that area. And you can see her moving around. This is a period of about a month and a half of movements. And you can see that, you know, sometimes she's sort of staying in one place and maybe foraging, and then other times she's making these faster directed movements across the landscape. And we wanted to capture, you know, the environmental features that she was using during each one of those movement bouts. So the first thing we did was we were wondering how far they moved during every one of those hour intervals in their GPS collar. Were they moving a lot? Were they not moving a lot? Were they moving differently at different times of day? So looking at bears across all seasons, we have step length on the y-axis. So they average about a 200-meter movement bout every hour. But that changes throughout the day. So we have time on the x-axis from midnight, you know, military time here all the way through 24 hours. And you can see that they're not as active at night and that they're mostly moving around during the day. And we sort of see these two humps in this line, and those humps are basically having to correspond with dawn and dusk. So they're moving around more during the day, but they're moving around even more during those dawn and dusk time periods. And then we wanted to break that out by season. So we wanted to know, okay, is it different depending on what season you're talking about? So we have that same step length on the y-axis. And then you can see in the springtime, that line is a little bit lower down on that graph. So they're not moving around as much in the spring. In the summer, they're moving around quite a bit more. They're moving around the most. And then in the fall, it's sort of in between those two other seasons. So they're moving around sort of a more moderate amount in the fall. But we see those same during the day. We see that they're definitely way more active during the day and more active during those dawn and dusk periods than moving around at night. Okay, so then we wanted to know, how are they selecting habitat? Were they avoiding certain kinds of habitat? Were they using other kinds of habitat? And so on these graphs, we have this straight line across at 1, it's that black line. And if you're above that line, it basically means that they're preferring those different habitat types. And if the color is below the line, it means that they're basically avoiding that different habitat type. And we have time again on the x-axis. So we're just seeing how that changes throughout the day. And we see that bears are mostly preferring forested areas and wetland areas. And that's not a surprise to us. You know, bears are a forest associated species. There's a lot of really yummy foods for them to eat in wetlands. But we can also see some of that use dropping off at night, as we would expect, because they're not moving around much at night. But then when we start looking at those more human-associated habitats, we start to see a different picture. So we see that they're avoiding agriculture in the spring and the summer. They're never really moving through agriculture very much at all. But then when we look at the fall season, we see that they're actually preferring agricultural areas at night in the fall. So they're basically changing their movement, their normal daily movement patterns, where they're mostly moving during the day, and they're changing that to move at night to take advantage of these agricultural areas. And we see similar patterns with roads and residential areas, where in the spring and the fall for these two, you see bears actually preferring to move through these areas at night, avoiding them during the days, and then during the summer, avoiding them at all times throughout the day. And so if you know a little bit about bear biology, this makes some sense, right? They're coming out of their dens and they're really hungry. They haven't eaten for months. They really need to put on the weight. And so they're coming out and they might be seeking some supplemental food resources in these residential areas and these human areas. So things like the bird seed that I mentioned earlier, things like dog food, things like garbage. There's a lot of really high calorie, high reward food resources for bears in residential areas. So it's not surprising that they might sneak into these areas at night to take advantage of these food resources in the spring. Same goes for the fall. So in the fall, bears go through something that's called hyperphagia, which literally means excessive eating. And they can eat upwards of 20,000 calories a day. So that's the equivalent of, I think it's something like 8 large cheese pizzas or 5 gallons of chocolate ice cream every single day. And to get a lot of those calories, again, those human food resources are really high in calories, so they don't have to work as hard if they can sort of sneak in and grab a bunch of birdseed or some dog food from someone's yard. So those were some cool patterns that we saw in the GPS data there. The other thing that we found was that a bear is not a bear is not a bear. So a lot of these population studies that people do is that they lump all their data together. They say, okay, this is our whole population. We're gonna analyze this data across all individuals and treat them all the same. But we knew from some previous research that bears in rural areas are not using the landscape the same way as bears in more developed or more urban areas. And so we really wanted to tease out those differences. And so we basically analyzed habitat use for every single individual bear in our study. And don't let this graph intimidate you at all. I'm gonna walk everyone through it. You could ignore most of it. But basically the blue lines on the graph means that the bears, more bears are preferring that habitat type, a higher number of bears. If it's an orange bar, it means a higher number of bears are avoiding that habitat type. And then I have the habitat types on the y-axis, but I'll just highlight some for you so you don't have to try and read that tiny font. So these two lines correspond with low density residential areas. So I think, you know, the more, not quite suburbia, but more sparsely developed areas, as you see a lot in the hill towns where a lot of you folks are. And what we see is an interesting dichotomy here, right? We see about half of our bears are actually preferring this residential, low density residential area, and half of our bears are avoiding it. And that's across all seasons and all times of day. But then when you start breaking this out into different seasons and times of day, you see some interesting patterns. So these two lines are still corresponding to that low density residential area. You see during the daytime in the spring, it's sort of the same as all seasons and all periods. But then in the spring at night, you see all the bears are preferring these low density residential areas. So they're all taking advantage of these areas during the springtime at night. And then if we just take a look at agriculture, we see that bears are generally avoiding agriculture at all seasons and all times of day. But then when you start breaking that out again, if you look at fall, you know, they're avoiding it in the spring, they're avoiding it in the summer, both day and night. And then in the fall during the day, you see some bears start to prefer those agricultural areas. And then at night in the fall, you see about a 50-50 split of bears using or avoiding agriculture. So you're really getting a lot more information when you start breaking things out over seasons and over different times of day and each individual bear. So then what we can do is we can put all of our models together and we can project the probability that a bear will move through any area of the state. And so on this map, what we see is the state of Massachusetts, with green areas having a very high probability of a bear moving through it. And then the red area is a very low probability of a bear moving through it. And we have one of these maps, for each season and each time of day. And it's interesting to see those differences, but that was a little too many maps to present in this presentation. So just to conclude on what we learned from doing that analysis is that, bears are moving around in general more during daylight hours, but that they're wanting to go into these human areas for those supplemental food resources, and that they're mitigating the risk of doing that by using these areas at night when human activity is low, so they can avoid us. And this shift is seen in the spring when natural food availability is low, and in the fall when they have those increased metabolic demands, when they're in that hyperphagia, hyper excessive eating state. And also that each bear is strongly individual. So from the study we learned bears are more like us. They each, some bears are more brave and more willing to go into human dominated areas, and other bears aren't. And so they have these individual differences that are important to think about when we're studying bear habitat use and movement and thinking about bear management. So does anyone have any, I'm going to move on to sort of a different research and different analysis. Does anyone have any questions? That was a lot of data and figures and everything I just threw at everybody. So I'm happy to break it down if anybody has more questions about any of that.
Kathy, I haven't seen anything come in yet by email or in the chat box, but folks, if you do have questions, email me, katie@hilltownlandtrust.org, or you can put a question in the chat box. And somebody just put in a question. What dictates how many bears get tagged?
Yeah, that's a great question. It honestly usually comes down to funding. So it's how many GPS collars can we afford for a season. Each GPS collar is fairly expensive. They're between $3,000 and $5,000 each. And because they're all satellite based now, you also have to pay for satellite service, which is also fairly expensive. But the cool thing is that you can literally get texts on your phone with GPS locations of the bear basically in real time. So that's pretty fun to have. But all of that is really determined by the state. So again, Mass Wildlife were our partners in this project, and they are responsible for collaring the bears. They tend to collar about 10 to 12 bears every year. And they collar them based on different research questions. So a few years ago, MassDOT was really interested in bear relationships to roads. And so they wanted to have bears collared that lived around roads, around different types of roads. And we actually used a much faster fix rate to capture where exactly they were crossing roads. So for that study, it was, I think it was a 15-minute fix rate. So we were getting a GPS fix every 15 minutes, and we knew where that bear was and where it was crossing roads. And more lately, there's more interest in bears in the Berkshires. And so there's been heavier emphasis on collaring bears in the Berkshires. From that earlier map, you may have noticed that most of the bears that had been collared were in the Pioneer Valley or the Quabbin area. So they're making an effort to sample more in the western part of the state. But yeah, about 10 to 12 bears per year. And it sort of depends on the research objectives that the state has in terms of where they're collaring those bears.
Kathy, we've had a few more questions come in. A couple questions about sort of bear interaction with people and their pets. Wondering sort of how many people have been injured by bears and how many bears have injured dogs in Western Mass. And there's a few more questions coming in too, but I'll let you address that one first.
Sure, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers, so I can't answer that question. I haven't, in the time I've been working on the project, I haven't heard of very many conflicts with pets. So yeah, sorry, I don't have that information. Mass Wildlife is a great place to go for for those kind of questions. And they have a website that's really informative. They have a few different web pages. One of them is Living with Bears, and a couple other pages that have a lot of information.
That's great. I would note too that we had an article in our spring newsletter written by a board member who's a biologist. And he was saying, which I didn't realize, that bears generally can really sense people coming, I think by smell, way before they get there, and tend to want to avoid us. So they'll kind of get out of the way before people come.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, yeah, it's that's a great point. I mean, I've been out in the woods a lot, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout my entire career, carrying lots of stinky stuff on my backpack that bears would love to have. And I've rarely encountered bears displaying any sort of aggressive behavior towards me or any one of my field crews. And just being out in the woods, they're very acute in terms of what they can hear and what they can smell. They have a great sense of smell. And so more often than not, they already know you're there, and have hightailed it out of there to avoid interactions with you. So yeah, great point.
Let's see, there was a question about if there was a difference between age or sex in how they move.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the short answer is yes. Basically, juvenile bears that have just left their mom, they're out there searching for new territories and new home ranges. So they're usually moving around quite a bit. That would be about when they're a year and a half old. And these are the bears that more often than not get into trouble because they're encountering new areas that they've never explored before. They're smelling new things. They haven't figured out how to stay out of trouble yet. So they're moving around more, and those are the bears that you might tend to see more than other bears that have already established their territories. Other than that, when they become old enough, usually about the age of 3, they reach reproductive age, so they can start breeding. For the females, if they have newborns, they're not moving around as much as females with yearlings or as male bears. So especially in the springtime, because the cubs are very young, they're very tiny, and they don't want to expose the cubs to a lot of new environments where there might be predators or danger for the cubs. So especially in the spring, they're not moving around as much. But other than that, that's pretty much where the differences end. Yeah.
Thanks, Kathy. There's another question about if it's true that some nuisance bears get moved to the Tallinn, Mass, Colchester, Connecticut area.
Again, that's a question for Mass Wildlife. I know that they have relocated nuisance bears. I haven't heard of them relocating it to another state. That would, yeah, they'd have to be working with the Connecticut Department of Wildlife for that. So I'm unaware of that happening, but again, a question for the state biologists.
Okay. And let's see, the last question that came in is asking about the GPS data seemed to focus on Central Mass with relatively fewer data points west of the Pioneer Valley, and curious why there wasn't more data from Western Mass.
Yeah, great question. It was because the state was really interested in this interaction between bears and where people were living, and because there's a lot more development through the Pioneer Valley and in central Massachusetts, they were more interested in collaring bears in those areas than in sort of the more rural areas of the state. But now, as I said before, they're starting to focus on Western Mass more and in the Berkshires for their collaring efforts.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Those are the questions that have come in so far, but if there are more that come in, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm gonna switch gears and talk a little bit about one of our newer projects. It just started last summer, was our first field season for it. And that is estimating the density of bears across the state, and then estimating population size of bears across the state. And we're doing that using, it's a non-invasive technique called hair corrals. In the scientific lingo, they're sometimes called hair snares, but we've learned that some people get a little scared off by that terminology. They're not snaring animals at all. They're just grabbing some hair from animals that happen to cross over one of these corrals. So the way that they're set up is that we string 2 strands of barbed wire, one at about knee height, one at about shin height, around 4 trees. And then we hang some really stinky stuff that bears would like. We use things like fish oil and caramel. We also used cooking oil, just a bunch of smelly things that bears would want to investigate. And we hang that in the middle. And so in order for them to really investigate what that scent is and to see if they might have some food reward, which they don't, but they don't know that yet, then they have to cross over or under the barbed wire in order to investigate. And when they do that, then the barbed wire snags a little bit of their hair. And then what we can do is we can take that hair and we can get the DNA from the hair, and we can identify actually individual bears. And what this allows us to do is estimate a population size. So we're not going to capture every single bear, but we will know how many bears we've captured, how many bears we may have recaptured. And from those numbers and information, we can run it through a model, and it will tell us the approximate number and density of bears in the different study areas we have in the state.
Kathy, there's another question that came in. Is there a limit to the potential number of bears? Do they mind overlapping territories?
Yeah, that's a great question. Male bear territories don't typically overlap a lot. They will overlap a little bit. And then within each male bear territory, there might be multiple female territories. So female home ranges are typically smaller than male home ranges. And so there could be multiple female home ranges within a male home range. And as with any animal population, there is a maximum. They can't, there won't be millions of bears in Massachusetts. It's all limited by the amount of food that's available. So if there's really, really high quality habitat, the home ranges don't need to be as large. So more bears can live in a smaller area. If the food resources aren't as good and bears have to range farther to be able to get enough food to survive and eat enough to den over winter, then the landscape will support fewer bears. So it's really dependent on how good the habitat is for bears in the state. Okay, so this was our sampling scheme for those hair corrals last year. We sampled 122 corrals across the state. And you can see that the corrals in the western part of the state are much closer together than the eastern part of the state. And that's because of those differences in home range size that I talked about earlier. The way it's recommended to sample is to sample a certain number of these sites for each home range size for the bears. And so that's why there's a difference there. And you'll also see these little red circles. Those circles are on Hilltown Land Trust land and trustees land. So as Katie mentioned earlier, they were really instrumental, really supportive of this project. And it was great to be able to put some of these hair corrals on their lands to be able to fill out our sampling grid and be able to sample in a systematic way across the state, which is going to make our analysis a lot easier and a lot more robust. So has been great working with them.
Kathy, Elaine was curious if you know the ratio of male to female bears.
That's a good question. I think it's about 50-50 but again, that hasn't specifically been studied for Massachusetts, but that is information that we will get from this hair corral study. We'll be able to know individual, what sex the bear was, and a whole bunch of other information. We'll be able to tell things like parent-offspring relationships. So we'll be able to tell, if a bear was born here, but is now all the way in Templeton or vice versa. So we'll be able to tell a lot of really great information from the genetic data. Okay. Okay, so here are some of what we got last year. We sampled for 9 weeks from the end of May to the beginning of August. And so the way this works is that every week we have field crews that go in and they check each one of these 122 hair corrals, and they collect any hair that was there, they rescent it, and then they sterilize all the barbs for the next week. And so over the course of the whole summer, we got 1,870 hair samples, so it was really successful. And so what I'm showing here are the size of those green circles are the number of samples we got over the course of the entire summer at these different locations for the hair corrals. And then I just wanted to show you sort of how this changes over the summer. So you can see week to week, bears are moving around, they're doing different things, they're checking out different hair corrals maybe, or maybe some weeks they weren't as interested in them for whatever reason, but this is how our samples changed on a weekly basis. We also had 27 camera traps that we were able to put on these hair corrals. And as Katie mentioned, they were able to put out some cameras too, which was fun. So we were able to actually cover more corrals. And we got 144 pictures of bears from those 27 sites. Some of these were pretty fun, a lot of moms with cubs. But we also got a whole bunch of different wildlife in Massachusetts. So you can see the whole list over here, but we got everything from moose to coyotes to fishers to bobcats to porcupines, and obviously lots of deer.
Kathy, we had another question. Someone's asking about how unusual it is to have 4 different individual bears that use the farm where they live. And apparently last year there were 5, but none were moms with cubs.
Yeah, it's not that unusual at all. I mean, if there's a good food resource, bears will tend to congregate there, and they'll allow, they'll allow each other to get close because they're not really competing for food resources. So if there's something like, some people have feed sites out, they just put piles of birdseed out for bears, they will get multiple bears from different bear families at a site. So, and the same is seen for some cornfields throughout the state where bears know that they're there and that it's a great food resource for the fall. So a lot of different bears will access that same resource. Yeah.
Kathy, we had another question. Someone was asking what kind of motion camera you use or suggest and how much they cost. I know the cost can range anywhere from maybe $100 to hundreds of dollars. But I know you can get a pretty decent one for around $150. I don't know about brands and specific ones. So maybe Kathy, you could address that.
Yeah, sure. I honestly cannot remember the brand that we use for most of our cameras. We actually compile them from different resources. So I think our study, USGS only had about 7, but we used a lot from Mass Wildlife and a lot from other partners. So it really ran the gamut. I know Bushnell is a good brand to use. There's another name that's escaping me right now, but I can get that information to Katie and she can pass it on. But yeah, I mean, you can get a pretty decent camera for about just over $100 that does everything from, you can have different settings for pictures or video, or yeah,
we had a comment come in from Julie, who I know does work with wildlife cameras herself, and she's saying Bushnell and Browning are great. Reconyx is awesome but expensive, and I know, yeah, they can really run the gamut. You can have ones that transfer data right to your cell phone, and those are going to be on the pricier end, and ones that you have to go out and check yourself, which can be a little more affordable. There was another question that came in if it's possible to download the data on a particular collared bear. Somebody has been seeing a collared yearling and with a sibling and a larger bear.
Yeah, so that would be Mass Wildlife data, and you'd have to contact them about it. They, with their new collars, I'm pretty sure they can download the data on the fly, but that is not something I have access to. Yeah. Okay, so what we hope to do with all of this DNA data, again, is to estimate the population of bears. Again, see if there are patterns of relatedness, or if there's patterns of connectivity or dispersal across the state. Are bears able to move evenly across the state, or maybe I-90 is a barrier, or the Connecticut River is a barrier? We'll be able to tell all of that information from the genetic data. And then we'll be able to also relate the genetic data to different landscape features. So like I just mentioned, our large highways more of a barrier to gene flow and the movement of bears than the Connecticut River, or mountain range, or maybe a large city or something like that. So we'll be able to tell that from the data as well. So that's basically all I had for today. I just wanted to acknowledge again, our close partners in this are Mass Wildlife. Also MassDOT has been a big supporter. They're working right now on analyzing how bears are crossing roads and moving across roads, and where to site maybe some crossing structures to help bears move across roads, since bears get hit by vehicles quite a bit. Also wanted to thank DCR and UMass Amherst. As Katie mentioned before, I'm no longer with the project. I just finished a couple weeks ago, and I'm now in Montana, but the project is still ongoing. So we were hoping to have a field season this summer, to do a second field season to collect that DNA. Unfortunately, we weren't able to because of the pandemic. So that is delayed until next summer. Once we have both summers worth of data, all the genetics will be analyzed. We're almost done analyzing all the genetics from last year, and we'll be able to come out with some initial results on those population sizes and densities across the state. But the Massachusetts Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Unit will be continuing this work along with Taya Christensen. So I have her name and contact information here. She's a collaborator on the project as well, and she's based at Amherst College, and she's a geneticist, so she's doing a lot of the genetic work for the project. So feel free to reach out to her with questions as well. And I'm happy to answer questions too. Feel free to email me anytime if you have questions about black bears.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I want to open it up if people have questions. There was one question that came in that they wanted waited till the end to ask, and I think it's a wonderful question, which is basically asking if people are able to help volunteer to monitor bears in the Quabbin area or beyond, either by camera or checking quadrants.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Taya is developing a website with some of her students to collect citizen science data on black bears. And I can share that information as well. But it's basically a website where you can go and you can put in points where you've seen black bears. And then she's also going to be looking for volunteers to, if you walk a trail every day with your dog, or you just go on maybe a birding walk every day or something like that, to have that be your sort of research transect for black bears. And then you can provide more detailed information on any bears or bear sign that you might see. So that's going to be part of the project as well. So there's definitely opportunities, and I can get, feel free to email Taya, or I can get that URL to you through Katie.
Thanks, Kathy. Let's see, I haven't seen any other questions come in. Someone was asking, they came in a little late, and they were asking if this is going to be recorded, and it is being recorded right now. And we're going to have the recording up on our website once we can get it processed, and we'll email that out to everyone. I just put a link in the chat box as well to a little feedback survey. It's pretty short, and you can just let us know what you thought of the presentation, which will go out in emails as well. If there are any other questions, please put them in the chat box.
I also, Katie, want to mention that there
Yeah,
are some people who are on the phone, and if you're on the phone, feel free to send an email with questions to Katie, which is katie@hilltownlandtrust.com, KATIE @hilltownlandtrust.org. There we go. And maybe Katie can type that in there.
Thank you, Allie. Yeah. Another question came in. Can anything be done regarding people who feed birds year-round? Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think education is really the best option here. You know, it's not like we can prevent people from putting bird feeders out on their property year-round, but I think educating them that a fed bear can be a dead bear. You know, if bears get more bold and more willing to get closer to people and people's houses, that bear can quickly become a problem bear that might have to be removed from the population. And, you know, I think a lot of people that love birds also love other types of animals. So if they're made aware of that, maybe they'll think twice about putting their bird feeders out all year long.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. This was a wonderful presentation. It was really great to learn more about your research. I know from my point of view at Hilltown Land Trust, I've been really curious what's been going on with the research, and it's so great to get a chance to learn more. It looks like from the chat box, other folks enjoyed it as well. So thank you for taking the time and joining us all the way from nearly across the country. I'm so glad that technology allows us to do that now.
Yeah, it was
I just wanted, oh yeah, sorry.
I just want to say it was great to be here and chat with everybody, and feel free to reach out with questions. You know, we should be having those initial results again sometime this fall, so we can share that with you and your members. And thanks again for your support of the project.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. We would love to be able to share with people more about the project through our website and other communications channels. And yeah, I just wanted to remind people you'll be getting a survey via email, so please do fill that out. It really helps us to, this is new to us doing these webinars, and it helps us to know how it went for you and what you thought of it, and if you have suggestions for other webinars we could offer. I'm also, we'll also email out the recording, and that'll be up on our website. And I would love to remind people as well, if you enjoyed this presentation, to please consider, if it's within your means, making a gift to Hilltown Land Trust to support offering these kinds of events online, and to support our work of land conservation, which of course includes wildlife habitat. I did put a link in the chat box that goes to our donation form on our website. And gifts in any amount are really appreciated and crucial to help us continue this work. So thank you. Kathy, thank you so much. Allie, thank you for organizing this and making this happen and bringing everybody together. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. And with that, I'm gonna stop the recording.